Have you ever wondered how an entire civilization fed itself on floating islands made of mud, roots, and dreams, without a single metal plow? In this quiet journey into the forgotten world of Aztec farming, we explore how women, often invisible, in the grand scroll of history, quietly engineered one of the most sustainable agricultural systems the world has ever known. While kings made war and temples reached toward the sky, these women shaped the earth beneath their feet layer by layer, season by season, crafting floating gardens that fed an empire for centuries. This isn't the history of conquests or gold. It's the story of slow hands in warm mud, of quiet decisions passed from grandmother to granddaughter, of how survival isn't always loud, it's often soft, rhythmic, and unnoticed. So lie back, close your eyes, and let the calm tide of forgotten history carry you across the canals of Tenochtitlan, where the real engineers weren't kings or warriors, but women with reeds in their hair and secrets in their soil. You're listening to Boring History for Sleep, and tonight we begin with the invisible engineers, women and the subtle work of Aztec farming. Beneath the reeds, the quiet builders of the Chinampas. You can almost hear the gentle lap of water against bundled reeds as you drift toward the floating edges of Tenochtitlan, the old heart of the Aztec world, nestled in the middle of Lake Texcoco. The morning mist hangs low over the water, and the scent is earthy, rich with lake silt, wet leaves, and the faintest trace of smoke from the early fires lit by those who tended these lands long before the city ever rose from the shallows. But we're not starting in the great temples, or with the warriors, or even the priests. No, we are starting in the mud. Literally, beneath every floating garden, every Chinampa was a quiet revolution in agriculture. And if you knelt down close enough, if you listened not just to the songs of the canoes or the whistles of the water birds, but to the faintest sound of woven roots settling into lakebed muck, you would find the hands of women there. These were not just gardens. They were engineering projects, centuries in the making. And they were kept afloat, quite literally, by women whose names never made it into most histories, but whose work fed an empire, the Chinampa. Not quite land, not quite lake too. The outsider, a Chinampa might have looked like just another patch of farmland. Long, narrow rectangles of rich green, filled with maize, chilies, beans, and squash. But to build one was to bend nature itself. A proper Chinampa began as a mat of woven reeds, staked into the shallow lakebed with long wooden poles. The builders, often entire families working together, would layer mud dredged from the lake, decaying vegetation, and rich compost, basket by basket, onto the mat. Over time, this pile would rise above the waterline, forming a small floating plot of arable land. To stabilize it further, willow trees were planted at the corners. Their roots reached down, grasping the lake bottom like fingers. Their canopies provided just enough shade, and their limbs were often shaped and trimmed by older women, who understood just how to coax them into shelter without cutting the light too much for the crops below. But what's rarely told is that the maintenance of these floating fields was, more often than not, women's work. Men might help lay the first reed mats or dig canal paths, but it was women, mothers, daughters, aunties, and widows, who tended the daily weeding, the composting, the delicate irrigation work, and the quiet observation of soil color and leaf health. They didn't write it down. They didn't build statues, but they watched. And that watching turned into knowledge, passed down not in books, but in hands, silt-stained fingers, and quiet authority. Imagine a woman named Tenochtitlan. Her name means black flower, and like many women in Tenochtitlan's floating districts, she wakes before dawn. Her fingers are already dark with dried mud from the day before. She ties back her hair with a strip of cloth, nothing ornate, and wraps a rough cotton hoopil around herself. No jewelry, no ceremony, just work. She walks the narrow path between Chinampas, each one no wider than a canoe is long. balancing a shallow clay bowl of duck droppings and ground maize husk. Fertilizer, her daughter trails behind, still yawning, holding a bundle of corn seedlings in a folded reed mat. They stop. Tenochtitlan kneels, pushing a hand into the soil. She doesn't speak at first. She just presses her palm against the dirt, tilts her head, and sniffs. The soil is still too wet. If they plant now, the roots might rot. Her daughter watches in silence. There is no textbook for this moment. There is no written record of how. The soil smells when it's ready. But she'll remember it anyway. They move on to another plot. These choices, repeated over thousands of Chinampas, across generations, were what made the Aztec Empire not just survive, but thrive. While other regions were plagued with drought, crop failures, or bad land, the Chinampa system produced up to 7 harvests a year. 7, from floating mud. And yet, in the codices, those beautifully painted Aztec documents, the names of women like Tenochtitlan are almost nowhere to be found. They were invisible engineers, food, fire, and the feminine domain. Aztec society, despite its militaristic image, revolved heavily around food, and food revolved around the home. And the home, as the Nahua people believed, was the domain of women. That didn't mean they were confined to kitchens. In fact, it meant they were entrusted with the literal and spiritual survival of their family line. Growing maize wasn't just planting, it was ritual. Women sang as they ground corn. They whispered small prayers as they boiled beans or tied up squash vines to drift above the water. The home fire was considered sacred, and its heat mirrored that of the sun god Tenochtitlan. Each time a woman prepared a Chinampa harvest, she wasn't just making food. She was reinforcing a cosmological balance between earth, water, and flame. That's why Chinampas weren't mere fields. They were part of a cycle, from lake bed to fire to mouth to offering, and back again. Yet, despite all this, their names still rarely appear in temple carvings or tribute lists. Still, the empire owed its strength not just to its warriors, but to its women farmers, and to the way they listened to the land with patient care. Bundles of reeds, baskets of secrets, in the quieter canals, where tribute collectors rarely visited and priests seldom walked. The real genius of the Chinampa system lay hidden in plain sight. Bundles of reeds, some tied loosely, others lashed tight, floated near the water's edge. To the untrained eye, they were just discarded scraps. But to a Chinampa caretaker, these were soil test plots. They would plant a few seeds in a floating reed bundle, watching how quickly they sprouted, how pale the leaves became, how dry the root felt when squeezed. These experiments, humble and quiet, taught generations when to rotate crops, when to dredge silt, and when to leave a Chinampa fallow. And they weren't done by scholars in feathered cloaks. They were done by women worn tunics, laughing softly as they patted down wet soil beside their toddlers, who played with frogs in the shallow water. These bundles weren't written into annals. They were tucked into stories, folded into lullabies, hidden in kitchen jokes passed between generations, and yet they built the backbone of Mesoamerican agriculture. The floating classroom, how knowledge drifted across water. There was no chalkboard on a Chinampa. There were no scrolls, no wax tablets, no letters inked carefully onto bark. There were only hands, weathered, sure, and silent. And there were eyes, always watching. A Chinampa wasn't just a farm. It was a classroom, a place where lessons were not spoken, but observed, where every woman was a teacher and every morning harvest, a kind of quiet lecture. Children learned to count not by numbers, but by how many squash fit in a reed basket. They measured time by the warmth of the soil under their feet, or the angle of the morning mist curling across the canals. And at the heart of it all was a slow rhythm, not of calendars or clocks, but of seasons sliding past like boats in the fog. A garden full of clues. If you stood still in the center of a Chinampa, you could begin to read its messages. The maize leaves pointed like arrows toward water. drooping slightly in early warnings. Off drought. The color of the soil told you whether the night had been cold. The patterns of birds pecking along the banks whispered which insects had hatched that week. And the women, those who had lived long enough to raise children, bury husbands, and replant the same patch of earth 20 times, could read all of it, the way others might read a sacred codex. One such woman might have been Yowalitzin, her name meaning little knight. She was not a priestess nor a noblewoman, but in the floating garden she had tended since girlhood, she taught children to braid reeds, feel root knots for rot, and even judge wind direction by the tilt of willow branches. Each Chinampa, you see, was not isolated. It was part of a network, a web of learning strung across water. And these lessons drifted slowly from raft to raft, passed by whispered instruction and quiet imitation. Mother, teacher, mapmaker. Imagine a small girl named Xochiquitl, flower skirt. She has just turned 5. She follows her mother, Yowalitzin, into the maze of floating fields. Her arms are too small to carry the reed basket, so she drags it behind her, bumping over each muddy plank. They stop at a patch of young amaranth. The leaves are light green, too light. Her mother points, touches the edge of one, and folds it gently. Then, with a calloused finger, she scoops up a bit of earth and lets it trickle between her thumb and middle finger. Nothing is said, but Xochiquitl watches. Later that evening, by firelight, she will copy that gesture in the ash beside the hearth. And she'll do it again the next morning, and again, until one day, her fingers know what the soil is saying before her mind does. This is how knowledge lived in Tenochtitlan. It wasn't hoarded. It wasn't centralized. It was memorized. Through gesture, preserved in routine, and passed down through the hands of daughters. Tools as teachers. The objects used in the Chinampa were also quiet instructors. A cracked clay scoop taught you how much compost to layer, just enough to fill it without it spilling. A reed rake taught spacing. The width between each prong matched the room maze needed to stretch. Even the old bundles of sticks used to stir canal silt wore grooves from decades of hands turning them just so, teaching grip and pressure with every movement. Children often learned first by play. They were given broken tools, old baskets, and miniature reed mats to mimic the work of their elders. To an outsider, this might have looked like mere amusement. But in truth, it was the beginning of apprenticeship, of learning the delicate timing of seeds and water, of knowing which leaf curl meant disease, and which meant too much shade. This wasn't a rote memorization. It was a felt knowledge, lived, tested, and passed along like a secret song only the soil could hear. Canals of communication. Women on Chinampas also communicated constantly across the water. Their conversations carried over the flat lake like wind. Comments about weather, soil, pests, crop timing, or even gossip about a neighbor's planting style. They didn't need written letters. Their messages were braided into daily observations. If one Chinampa had too many beetles, another might hang ash-soaked cloth over her maize the next day. If someone's squash vines turned yellow, others adjusted how deeply they buried their compost. This constant, informal sharing created a decentralized intelligence, a kind of floating network of agricultural memory, always growing, always refining. Modern systems might call it peer-to-peer learning or distributed knowledge. But for the women of the Chinampas, it was just the way things were done, learning without leaving. There's something tender, even sacred, about learning that happens without separation. In the Chinampa world, girls were rarely sent away to school. They did not leave the farm to gain wisdom. They stayed within it, alongside their mothers and aunts and grandmothers, and in doing so, inherited more than instruction. They inherited stories tied to each plot of land. They learned where lightning once struck a willow tree, where a turtle laid eggs that one year, where maize always grew taller after a certain kind of spring fog. This memory, ecological, familial, emotional, became part of who they were. A field wasn't just a place to grow food. It was a record of your people's quiet victories. The last harvest, what survived after the mud dried. The sun still rises over the valley where Tenochtitlan once floated, but it rises now over stone, over roads and buildings and noise. The Chinampas, those shimmering webs of floating green, are mostly gone, buried beneath concrete, swallowed by canals now dry or paved over. Yet the women who once shaped them, quietly and with no fanfare, left behind something far more persistent than reeds or roots. They left behind knowledge that refuses to be forgotten when the waters receded. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked more than a military defeat. It marked the slow collapse of an ecological genius that had taken centuries to build. The Chinampas, so delicately balanced between water, silt, and sun, were foreign to the new rulers. They saw them not as innovations, but as curiosities, inconvenient and in the way of horses and carts. And yet, for many years after the conquest, the Chinampas clung on, and so did the women who knew how to tend them. The invaders brought steel, plows, and European crops. But the land did not yield to their tools as easily as it had to the hands of those who had lived with it. The soil resisted. The floods returned. And in quiet corners of the former empire, the old ways continued. Women still layered silt over compost, still tied maize to willow stakes, still taught daughters to judge the wind by the scent of water. But the world around them was changing too fast to keep up. In the shadows of empire, by the late 1600s, most of the canals around Mexico City were clogged or drained. The lakes had been reduced, redirected, or poisoned. And with them, the floating gardens began to shrink, no longer endless webs of green, but small, stubborn patches of earth. Still, a few survived. In the shadows of churches and markets, women like Tenochtitlan, renamed Dona Isabel by her Spanish godparents, taught her granddaughter how to mend reed mats. She told her how her own mother had once grown tomatoes so sweet, the ducks would wade into the Chinampa to steal them. These were not grand stories. They were stories of meals, of pests, of patience. And yet, they carried centuries of precision, of adaptation, of silent engineering. They were the blueprints of survival, disguised as daily life, the Chinampa that wouldn't die. By the 19th century, as trains hissed through the former empire and factories coughed into the sky, Chinampa farming remained in just one significant area, Xochimilco. There, women still stood barefoot in soft mud, still planted maize beside marigolds, still trusted the moon to tell them when to trim willow branches, still floated between plots and canoes handed down from grandmothers whose names no one outside the village remembered. And they taught. They taught without books, without degrees, without recognition. They taught because they always had, because the soil still whispered the same rhythms it had whispered to Uwalitzin, to Xochiquitl, to the daughters of women whose names were never carved in stone. In Xochimilco, Chinampa farming continued, not because it was efficient by modern standards, but because it was enough. It was resilient. It didn't require machinery. It required memory, and that memory was held in the hands of women. Legacy in the mud. Today, only fragments of the old Chinampa system remain. They're tourist attractions now, in part. Brightly painted boats carrying curious visitors over. The last patches of ancient agriculture still clinging to the edges of Mexico City. But look closer, and you'll still find women there. Older women, dressed in worn skirts and sun-wrapped shawls, who plant with the same timing their mothers taught them. They may not call it a classroom, they may not call themselves engineers, but their work remains a feat of hydrology, of botany, of architecture, done with no calculations, only tradition. Done without schematics, only wisdom. And though the fields are smaller now, and the city presses ever closer, the lessons remain. How to listen to the land. How to teach without speaking. How to grow not just food, but the memory of your people. The quiet engineers of history. When we think of innovation, we imagine grand names of Da Vinci, of Archimedes, of rulers and generals and architects with titles carved into marble. But what of the woman who knew the exact week to dredge canal mud for nitrogen? What of the girl who could name 6 kinds of shade by how maize leaves curled? What of the grandmother who noticed that her reeds bent earlier each year and took that as a warning about drought? Their names weren't recorded. Their inventions were too subtle to patent. Their designs dissolved with the water and returned. Each season like the frogs they coexisted with, but they were engineers, invisible ones. They engineered survival. Not with spectacle, but with steadiness. Not with theory, but with tradition. Not with blueprints, but with muddy hands and patient daughters. Thank you for spending this quiet moment in history with us. If tonight's story helped you relax, drift off, or simply brought you a bit of calm curiosity, we'd be truly grateful if you'd take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the Quiet Boring Sleep channel. Every click helps us keep bringing you more gentle, thoughtful stories from the forgotten corners of the past. Until next time, sleep well, dream gently, and remember, history doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful. Good night and take care.